If you hurt this morning, if you're sitting there and you can hardly move and you wish I'd quit preaching so you could get up because your back is killing you, or there's something in your life that's incredibly painful, like a marriage, the question I have for you is, will you believe this? Will you believe that it is love from a Heavenly Father? I'm not asking you to understand fully. I'm asking you to believe.
How should we view the painful trials in our lives? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper turns to Hebrews 12:3-11 to reveal how our Father lovingly uses suffering to lead us deeper into His holiness. This sermon was originally delivered at Bethlehem Baptist Church on August 24th, 1997.
What kind of suffering is it, and where did it come from? Very simply, it's coming from hostile adversaries. This was true back in chapter 10, imprisonment, plundering. It was true in chapter 11, verses 35 to 38. You don't get sawn in two by anybody but an adversary. We see it most clearly in verses 3 and 4. Consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners. There's the phrase. That's a key phrase. Such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. So the link with Jesus draws out the link with hostility. And so the main source of pain in this chapter is persecution. Short of martyrdom so far, but it may be on the way. Now, where did it come from? Who's doing it? Who's in charge of doing it? And verse 3 said, consider him who endured such hostility by sinners. That's who's doing it, right? Sinners have expressed hostility and shown it against Jesus, and now they're showing it against these Christians. That's the first answer, and it is not the main answer, nor the most important answer, nor the answer on which this entire text is built. It's an incidental answer. The main answer is God is in charge here. He is in ultimate control of this hostility that is being shown against them. And what they are experiencing under the lash or in the prison or the mockery is, according to this text, the discipline of God. That's the burden of this whole text, is it not? That God is disciplining His people. Now let's get it before us. Read it from the text. Don't take it from my mouth. Let's read verses 5 to 7. After describing what they're in for and what they're dealing with, and how they're growing weary and losing heart in this awful battle against the hostility that's being shown against them, He says to them in verse 5, quoting Proverbs 3, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by Him. Verse 6, for those whom the Lord loves, He disciplines, and He scourges every son whom He receives. Verse 7, it is for discipline that you are enduring. In other words, what the adversaries are doing out of sinful hostility, God is doing out of fatherly discipline. I'll say that again. You've got to hear this. This is incredibly important, and this is what is not believed by millions of professing Christians. It says that what adversaries are doing to Christians, to you, out of sinful hostility, God is doing to you out of discipline by a loving Father. Notice, it does not say that God looks on while hostile sinners and Satan beat you up, and then come into you and say, I can fix that. I can even turn that for your good. That is not what the text says. It says something totally different. It says God is disciplining, He's teaching, He's correcting, He's transforming. In other words, God has a purpose and a design in what is happening to us. God is the ultimate doer here in these things. Look at verse 6 again. Let's get this phrase, this shocking phrase in this context right before us. Second half of verse 6. It goes so far as to say, God scourges. Now that word is used in chapter 11 along with imprisoned, killed by the sword, sawn in two, scourged. God scourges every son whom He receives. Who is scourging? Who is spanking? Who is whipping? God is. God is not a passive observer in our lives while sinners and Satan make us miserable. He rules over sinners. He rules over Satan, and they unwittingly and with no less guilt and accountability fulfill His wise and loving purpose for the discipline of our lives. Now, this is not believed by many Christians. It's just not acceptable, as clear as it is on the face of this text. They say God is not in charge of the world. He deeded it over to Satan. He has limited Himself by the free will of these hostile people and cannot, dare not intervene and does not design and does not work in and through these sinful acts of hostility. Well, the text says that the hostility of sinners against these Christians is real, it is wrong, they are responsible for it, they are guilty for it, and this is our hope, it is the loving, painful discipline of our Heavenly Father. That's what the text clearly says. It does not say God watches Satan do it or watches the free will of men do it and then comes in and makes it all work for good. That's not what the text says. That's called repair, not discipline. It's the difference between a surgeon who plans the incision and the emergency room doctor who just fixes you after a freak accident. There is a difference. The surgeon plans, he thinks, how can I heal? How can I bless? How can I save? How can I make whole? That's the questions surgeons ask before there's any cut. The emergency room doctor gets cuts. And he's got to be creative and then fix it up best he can. This text is about surgeon, our surgeon in heaven. It's clear what the text says. Now, someone might ask, does this principle of discipline apply to things like natural calamities, hurricanes, flooding, and sickness, cancer, Alzheimer's, ulcers. Is God in all of those things sovereignly working discipline in His people's lives? Or are we only talking about persecution here, and those things are in another category, and God has nothing to do with those, and they have no bearing on the discipline of our lives to bring about holiness and life? Now, to answer that question, I would ask a question, and I want you to try to answer this as I pose it. Which is harder for God to do, or harder for us to conceive of God doing? To attribute to God the hostility of sinners against His people, torturing them, or to attribute to God the destruction of a hurricane or flood? Which is harder? Which creates more problems for God and for us? Now, I think the answer is, it is much harder to attribute to God sovereign control of the hostility of sinners against His people than it is to attribute to God the effects of a hurricane. The reason is this: in both cases, pain is caused. Horrendous pain. When people crucified Jesus, there wasn't any greater pain to bring on a human body. And when hurricanes flatten a bridge or a building and crush hundreds of people, that's pain. So in both cases, whether the free will of man is beating up on somebody or whether a hurricane is beating up on somebody, pain is a mega problem and issue to deal with. But in the case of hostility, you got another mega problem to deal with, namely the will of man. And to say that God somehow overrules and guides and has a design in the wickedness of those who beat up on Christians is more and harder than to say that God guides the winds. Now, if that's true, this text says that the harder thing is true. And therefore, I can't imagine why anybody, having believed this text, would want to deny the easier thing. Did that make sense? I wonder. I'm trying to read your faces here. How much do I have to say again of what I just said? It is more problematical theologically to believe that God rules the wills of men in the hostility they bring against Christians than it is to believe that He rules hurricanes that only cause physical pain. This text teaches that God makes the hostility of people His own discipline, and thus does the harder thing theologically. Therefore, it's a piece of cake to believe that He rules hurricanes. If you can handle the one, which is so much harder to handle, you can handle the other. And many people do not handle the one. They simply don't believe it. And I want you to believe it. So my conclusion is that God disciplines us both in persecution and in cancer. And I said to Glenn this morning, I said, this is going to be a hope-filled and a hard word. And I could name a dozen others of you. One of you, I know because of an email you sent me this week. I've sent you one back. I hope you got it. I bless you for that email. Told the story of how she was so thankful that years ago she came into this strong teaching about the sovereignty of God over pain before she had to go through what she just went through in this last year. And she extolled the goodness of God and made my heart leap that God had ministered so deeply to her. Now, if you're wondering whether my conclusion rests on logic, that was a logical thing I just did for you there. It doesn't. It rests on Exodus 4:11. Who made man's mouth? Who makes him dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? You don't have to depend on logic to believe these things. All you have to believe is the Bible. Exodus 4:11. Who made man's mouth? Who makes him dumb or deaf or seeing? And I know perfectly well that there are blind people in this room. Kathy just taught Sunday school. I love Kathy. Who made man's mouth? Who makes him dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? If you, in order to have hope in this life, need a limited God, you're not going to get it at this church. If you find hope in a God who has a design, is there a design in it? Okay, I hear you saying this hard thing that He rules somehow mysteriously in His sovereignty and His providence over both the hostility of evil people and the hurricanes and the diseases. I hear you saying that. What in the world is He up to? If you will find hope in believing that He is up to something gloriously good, then you'll find hope here and in this text. So let's just briefly look at this third thing. What's the design? It's real clear. It's just as clear as daylight in this text. Verse 6, those whom the Lord loves, He disciplines. So my first answer to the question is, it's a loving design. If you hurt this morning, if you're sitting there and you can hardly move and you wish I'd quit preaching so you could get up because your back is killing you, or there's something in your life that's incredibly painful, like a marriage, the question I have for you is, will you believe this? Will you believe that it is love from a Heavenly Father? I'm not asking you to understand fully. I'm asking you to believe. This whole section is about faith. By faith, by faith, by faith. By faith, those people who were sawn in two. By faith, they were killed by the sword. By faith, they were imprisoned. And so it will be with you. Verse 7, it is for discipline that you endure. God is dealing with you as sons. It isn't hate, it's love. It isn't slavery, it's sonship. You're not being taken out and beat up like a slave would be beat up. You're not an enemy of God. And yet everything in your flesh cries out, quit treating me as your enemy. You feel it? He won't answer probably why it's your turn now. And so, he deserves it. He won't probably answer that question. He won't tell you why now and not later. He won't tell you why this much pain and not less. He won't tell you why it's lasting this long and not that long. He just tells you, if you're willing to believe it, I really love you in this. I really love you in this. And I am wise, and you need to trust me. Verse 10, in the middle of the verse, He disciplines us for our... Let's collect the words now as we close. He disciplines us for our good, that we may share His holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful but sorrowful, yet those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. You get all those words? Good, holiness, peace, righteousness. When you cry out, and I don't doubt that I will cry out also in the day of my calamity, why? I hope that after a message like this and many others in Sunday school classes, that even though what we mean in that hour of agony is, why me? Why now? Why this much? Why this way? There is a why. There is a why. The question is, will you take it? God inspired this chapter so that you'd have a why. It's a big, broad, solid why. It is not a specific why. Why you? Why now? Why this much? Why this long? But it's a big, broad, solid rock on which you can stand. So my closing exhortation is verse 9b. You see the second half of verse 9 there? It says, be subject to the Father of spirits and live. The question you have now as we go is this: will you rebel against this chapter? Will you kick against this teaching? Or will you do what verse 9 says? Be subject to the Father of spirits and live. If you will submit to a sovereign, loving, fatherly design in, over, and through all the pain of your life, you will not grow weary and lose heart. There's a wrestling in the Christian life. And we're prone to grow weary, especially if we're sick. Grow weary, lose heart, especially if someone we love is sick, especially if it's late nights and early mornings, especially if it's a little child who's sick. We will not grow weary and we will not lose heart.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 8-part series, The Gospel Changes Everything for Us, with the sermon titled, Why Does God Discipline Us? I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.